So far so good. Welcome back, and in this tutorial we are going to talk about scripting. So we are going to start writing our first C# script, and with that script we are going to learn a little bit about the very core understanding of C#. All right. Yeah, so I'm just going to first configure this scene a little bit so that we can have some object to play with. All right, so I'm just going to delete this just for now, and I'm going to start by right clicking on my hierarchy, go to 2D object, sprites, and I am going to use a square. I'm going to call it player. Now remember, everything in Unity is a game object. So this guy is also a game object. This game object has two components currently: transform, sprite renderer. All right. Now when we are trying to write a script in C# in Unity, that means basically we are adding a new component. All right. So the script itself is a component in Unity that can gives us some extra control to our game. What does that mean? So well, if I now play this game, nothing happens, right? We have talked about game object. We have been saying that everything in Unity is a game object, but if we cannot do anything with the game object, there is no meaning. So for this case, we are going to make this game object act as a player. Now what does our player going to do? Well, our player going to move. First of all, because this is a space shooting game, this player should move and this player should shoot. So we have found two properties for our player. Our player can shoot and our player can move. So these are the first thing when you are writing code. These are the first things that you need to think about, that what is the purpose of our code, what we are going to do with this. So what are the properties of this object going to be? We have found that our player, this game object, the player can move and this player can shoot. So it has two different functions. All right, so yeah, so let's first create a folder, and we're going to hold all the scripts in here, and I'm going to right click, create an C# script. In here I'm going to just name it player. So what just I did, what did I do? I just created a new C# script. This script is just like a component. I have mentioned that before. So if that is a component, that means we can add it here, right? Because I have mentioned you that everything in the right hand side in our inspector is a component. So that means we can also add this player in here. Simple, right? So now our player has three different components. Our player has a transform component. Our player has a sprite renderer component, which is showing this, giving the visual of our player. And finally, our player has a script called player. Now with the script, we can basically give all the property that we need to give to the player. For example, we have been talking about that our player can move. So let's start by giving that property to our player. Double click on this script and this will take you to the code editor that you have installed. For most of you it should be Visual Studio. For some of you it might be Rider. If you are stuck, again, if you don't know how to install it, go back and look into the tutorial where we installed it, and when your installation is done, you are ready to go. So when I opened up this C# script, we can see a lot of things going on here. We have no idea what they are, so let's break it down. The first three lines in our script is basically called namespaces. Okay, so these are all namespaces. These are all the reference for our script, and you are going to understand that just in a bit. So for now, remember that these are called namespaces, and we use this to make a reference between the things that we are going to use here and the script itself. Just gonna talk about that in a bit. Then we have something called public class player. So player is the name of our script, so that's good. Public means this is going to be visible to everyone. We're going to talk about public private in future classes. What is the meaning of class? We're going to talk about that as well later on. Then we have mono behavior. Now every script in Unity by default is a mono behavior. When you see this means player is mono behavior. Okay, so always like read this as a is, or you can read it as extends. Okay, so we're going to talk about inheritance in future classes. Then it is going to be more more understandable to you. For now, just remember that everything in Unity's script is basically a mono behavior. All right, so all this complex stuff is done. Now we have a curly braces. This is important. When we create a C# script in Unity, it should have a start curly brace and an end curly brace. That is where you write all your code. You cannot write your code in here, for example. Okay, so everything should go inside these two curly braces, and inside these curly braces we again have two things. It's saying event function in the top, and it's saying start is called before the first frame update, and then we have another one called update. Now these things are called functions or methods. All right, so again we're going to talk about methods and function in the next classes. So if things are a little bit complicated for now, don't worry about it much. But remember that when we start our game, this thing will be automatically called, right? You play your game, in that moment this function will be get called, and then the update, this will be getting called over and over again as long as you play the game, right? So in every second it might be get called for 60 times or 30 times or 120 times. That is based on the frame rate of our game, so that is called frame per second. All right, so this method, the update method, is going to be get called in every single frame, so 60, 70, 100 times in each second. All right, so yeah, so that is basically the breakdown of our script. So now let's get started and start some coding. To make things a little bit cleaner, I'm just going to delete all these methods, right? So now it looks a lot simpler to you, so I'm just going to delete that. All right, the first thing that we need to our player is we need to figure out what does a player has. Okay, we know our player has a sprite, right? And we already saw that sprite in here, right? So maybe we could do something like that, but that is a little bit, down the road. So let's start with something really simple. What does our player has? Our player can move, so the player should have a speed, right? So I'm just going to do public. Oops, not that. I'm just going to do int speed. Now what does that mean? These things are called variable. Now let's talk a little bit about variable. What does a variable do? What is a variable? Now variables are just like cups, right? So you can store data into there. You can store data into variable. All right, store stuff. Okay, so for our case, we are just going to store what? We're going to store a speed of the player. Now what is int, what is private, what does all these things do? Let's break that down first. Now in variable we have three things. First of all, we have a name, right? So we can use any name. There's a few convention. Number one, you cannot, the first condition to create a name for a variable is the name should start with alphabets, right? Number two, no space. All right, so that means you cannot name a variable with something like 2s 2d. You cannot do that. It has to be something like maybe d2. That is valid. All right, you cannot do 2d. For example, there is no space, so that means I cannot do, this is not correct. So speed y, if I do something like this, that is not correct, that is wrong, because there is a space in between them. But I can just do a underscore. I can just add a underscore or a hash in between them so that there is no space in between them. All right. So what else? You cannot use any special character into the variable's start name. So for example, if I now try to create a variable called int, like this, it's not going to work because some of the special characters has a special meaning in C#. So you cannot do that. For example, you cannot do something like this, right? So make sure you don't use any special character. Sorry, no special characters. So that was the first thing. We need a variable. These are called variables. Variable should have a name. It should have a data type. Now, what are data type? Now remember, when we started talking about variable, I was saying that variables are stuff that can hold things, right? These are basically container that can hold data. So what kind of data which container can hold can be different, right? So for example, if you now try to like store a glass of water, you need a cup. If the cup is made out of net, all your water will be leaked. So that means you cannot store water in a like net sort of container. You need a solid glass to store that particular object. So similarly, if you are trying to store a particular data, you need to define what sort of data that is. So for example, if you want to store numbers, you need a int or double or float, right? You need this sort of data types. If you want to store, for example, name, then you need, just gonna clean up a little bit. Yeah, if you want to store something like a name, then you need to have a different sort of data type, string, right? Character. If you want to store something like true false thing, true or false, then you need a boolean type of data type. All right, so there is this different sort of data type that we can use. I'm going to go in detail on these variables in a separate lecture. For now, let's see what have we learned till now. We have talked about variables. Variables are basically things that can store data, and we need to define the name, and as well as we need to define the type of the data. So what is a speed? A speed is a number. All right, so we know that it should be either int or float or double. All right, so I am going to use int for now. Now what is int? Int is, it goes for integer. That means no decimal point number. All right, what is float? Float is, it can be a decimal point number. What is double? Double is a bigger float, okay? Bigger decimal point number. That's it. So now we are going to declare the speed of the player. Can the speed can a speed be a decimal number? Yeah, it can be a decimal number, so maybe we should not use int, we can use float, right? So you can use float speed. Now after we are done, we should put a semicolon. Now when I put a semicolon, you can see by default there is another keyword called private. Now in C# there is something called encapsulation. We're going to talk about that in like maybe the third game. So for now, remember that private means this thing cannot be visible inside the Unity editor. Public means is visible. What does that mean? Just let's make it public. If I now save it, actually let's make it private first. Save it, go back to Unity. As you can see, nothing has changed in our player here, right? So for example, in the sprite renderer there is a few fields: sprite, color, flip, draw mode, etc. But for a player there is nothing in here. There is only something called script. So how about we go back and make it a public? Let's see what happens then. Now you can see the speed is visible inside our editor. So that is the significance of public and private just for now, but there is more about it. Okay, so we're going to talk about public, private later on. So yeah, so this is variable. Variable now can store a particular data. For our case, it can store the speed of the player. We can actually use it here. We can just initialize it by using an equal sign and then a value, right? If we go back, you'll see that that change in the script has not been modified here. So we can just manually do it in here, speed equal 5. So we can change it manually from the script. We can change it to 10, we can change it to 15, and so on. Now we have a variable. How can we create another variable? So that is going to be your task. So this is going to be the task 1. So define a variable of type float. No, I'm not going to say that. Define a variable that can hold the health of the player, right? How can you do that? Remember, when we are thinking about this, first of all, we think that what sort of variable that we need. We need a variable that can store the health of the player. Then you think that what is a health? Is it a number? Is it a string? What is it? And then after you figure that out, you just follow this rule and then you got it. You just create a variable. All right. You can initialize it with some number or not. It's up to you. And remember to put a semicolon in the end. And if you do public, it will be visible inside Unity. If you don't do public, it is not going to be visible inside Unity. All right. So yeah, so that's all about it in this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to use this variable in some sort, because there is no point storing a variable if we cannot even use it. Right. So yeah, so I'll see you in the next lecture, and don't forget to complete your task.